Welcome to week 6, geographers. So we'll be looking at chapter 9, South Asia, and chapter 10, East Asia this week. For South Asia, we'll investigate 7 different countries. So moving eastward from Afghanistan, where we last left off, we have Pakistan all the way over to Bangladesh, which interestingly enough used to be one and the same nation of Pakistan. So we'll examine these 6 nations, and then we'll move midweek into East Asia, which is a refinement of 6 nations. Basically, abutting Central Asia, we have Mongolia, China, the Koreas, Japan, and Taiwan. So when we begin our investigations of the Indian subcontinent, we're going to look at some of the unique geomorphology that has helped create this total environmental system. In particular, we'll investigate the hydrologic cycle and how intimately involved the glacial meltwaters of the seasonal flooding from the Himalayas are as they combine with the seasonal rains of the monsoon. And we'll get to see how important this is to not only agriculture, to population, but to the long-term cultural geography of the land. So we'll look a little bit more into the history of South Asia, continuing our trends of investigating early world historical cultural hearths. We'll get a chance to look at the IVC, the India Valley Civilization, at Mohenjo-Daro and some other sites, and we'll kind of look at, interestingly enough, how these had cultural connections in trade regimes, which connected all the way over to the Tigris and Euphrates. And we find lapis lazuli in Sumeria, back in 3rd century, 3000 BC. Carrying on, we'll look a little bit of the unique linguistic geography of India, and we kind of see this as the furthest eastward spread of the Proto-Indo-European language groups. And we'll kind of get to see how these sorted themselves within the linguistic geographies of the subcontinent when compared to some of the indigenous language groups that were Dravidian, like Kannada. So we'll look a little bit into that, and we'll analyze some of these things that regard agriculture and industrialization, and we'll look into demography of India, which currently is the 2nd largest country in the world, but is on a trajectory to outstrip even China within your guys' lifespan here in coming decades. We'll also look at some of the trends of urbanization in some of the larger cities in India, and we can also look into, as we did in South America, with concepts of favelas and barrios, and we'll get to look into places like Dharavi, which are some of the largest slums in the entire world. We'll look at some of the largest religions in the world, which had their origin story in the Indian subcontinent with, first off Hinduism and then later with Buddhism. And we'll kind of look at how these ideas and concepts have spread across the nation. We'll also look at how Hinduism has particularly affected some of the social geography and social stratification by examining a little bit about the caste system and the implications of this in the organization of society. Finally, we'll look a little bit more into the conflict between Hinduism and Islam as manifest in India, and the division between Pakistan and India. And inserting the colonial power structure in this, we will examine the role of Britain and look a little bit into extraterritoriality at this stage and how they gained access in their colonial rule over India. Moving forward, we'll look at some of the unique environmental challenges that face places like Bangladesh, who suffer a lot of seasonal flooding that affects some of their largely agrarian population groups. So when we move into chapter 9, where we study East Asia, we're going to do a lot of things. China is an immense nation, so we don't have much time to examine the history of empiricism and look at the dynasties of China, which have helped variously form its population, regionalization, and cultural trends. But for the most part, we will just kind of look at the different regions of China, and we have mountainous wests, and we have various deserts and basins and steppes to the north and the northeast. And for the most part, we have our cultural hearth in these low-lying river valleys to the east. And this is basically where we find the cultural hearths of the Wei River Valley civilization. We look at some of the early rise of China. Continuing on, we'll look a little bit further into the concept of extraterritoriality and some of the, again, British colonialism in China. But further on, we will compare it to some of the things going on with the transnationalization of labor when we looked at maquiladoras in Mexico and Central America back in chapter 3. And we'll look at things like extraterritorial zones and special trade zones in China. Going forward, we'll look a little bit more into the history of collectivization and communism, by very briefly touching upon the Cultural Revolution and some of these other things that occurred within the 20th century and the so-called modernization of China. To set this base, we'll look at some of the historical, philosophical, and cultural trends which influence some of these patterns in China, such as the presence of Confucius and Lao Tzu, and how Confucianism and Taoism helped shape a lot of the cultural norms, which helped with a lot of the cultural geography and the development. We won't just spend our time in China. We'll look at Japan and the Koreas, and we'll look at some of their modernization and their urbanization, and how this has affected the spatial organization of not only their city, but their economic infrastructure. We'll also look at some of the economies of East Asia, known as the Asian tigers, and how these have really advanced at a greater pace than a lot of other places in the last several decades. Another big unit, we have the two most populous nations in the world here with China and India. And we will do a little bit of a dichotomy where we can compare the two and look at some of these various trends with different population pyramids and different social policies and different national and military policies. We can also kind of project some of these impending confrontations that may occur within the expansion of China into the South China Sea